Good morning, everyone. Sorry I can't be there today, but we'll have a very short class today. Just wanted to get us introduced in how we set prices here in America and in other capitalist nations. Prices in capitalist nations are agreements between the producer and consumer. Government typically has little to nothing to say about it. Um, and as we said before, technically, the producer could set whatever prices they want. They could set prices at millions of dollars. But in reality, if they do that, they're not going to sell anything. So the power is shared between both the buyers and the sellers. Thing is, their motives are exactly opposite. The buyer wants the prices as low as possible. The seller wants the prices as high as possible. How is it possible for these two exactly opposing forces to compromise? And the truth is, it's a lot simpler than you might think. Having two equal and opposite forces pulling against each other actually makes it pretty easy to find where's the exact middle. And that exact middle is called the equilibrium point. Maybe you've heard about equilibrium in chemistry. That's when two equal and opposite like chemical reactions are happening at the same time, and so there is no overall change in condition. For instance, if you have the pressure and temperature just right in a closed container, you can have ice melting into water and also water freezing into ice. And you can have that happening at the exact same rate. So at any given time, you have the exact same ratio of ice to melted water. And you can actually find the equilibrium point between all three states of matter. If you have the precise temperature and pressure in a closed container, you can have ice melting, water boiling, steam condensing, and water freezing, all at the exact same ratio. So you have the exact same amount of ice, water, and steam. And I think that is pretty awesome. Anyway, in economics, equilibrium is that point in which producers and consumers agree upon the best price. Uh, I wrote here there's only one price that producers and consumers agree upon. That's not exactly correct. As you see with these lines, uh, demand there will be a little demand anywhere along this line. So almost no matter what the price, you will find some people buying and some people selling. But if you get way to the edges, that's going to be very few people buying over here or very few people selling over here. So market equilibrium is really the point at which supply and demand are exactly equal, where the suppliers are making just as much as people want to buy, no more, no less. If they put the price too high, not enough consumers will buy, and there will be extras left over. If they set the price too low, the producers won't sell and they won't produce, and then people want more than there is, and there's not enough to go around. So you have to find the Goldilocks zone just right, and that's what the equilibrium is. The price isn't too high, it isn't too low, it's just right for the most number of people. Now, with this equilibrium, it is not a perfect price. Not everyone will be happy. There will be many producers who would rather sell it at a higher price, and there will be some consumers who won't buy it all because they want it at a lower price. But the equilibrium is the point where the most number of producers and the most number of consumers will agree upon and will sell exactly the same amount of items that people will buy. Equilibrium is fluid, it constantly changes, just like there's constant changes in demand and there's constant changes in supply. Those lines shift left and right. And so therefore the intersection of supply and demand is constantly shifting up and down, left and right. And there's many reasons for that. The subjective value of the producer is changing. And so what the producer demands for the sale is changing. The subjective value of the consumer is changing. So what they're willing to pay is constantly changing. Related prices have nothing to do uh, with our product, but somehow relate to it. If they change anything, then that's going to change us, no matter if we do anything. Raw materials and other costs are going to change constantly, so that will definitely affect prices. And there's, of course, thousands of other reasons why prices would change left to right, and why consumers are going to be willing to buy more or less. So the equilibrium, the intersection point, always changes. Producers can smooth out the equilibrium point by making sure they have only the exact and right number of items on the shelf. Remember, supply is not necessarily the exact number of items that are produced, it's the exact number of items that is for sale right now. So if you have a giant warehouse filled to the brim with, let's say, new iPhones, those are not for sale right now. They're in storage. And because they're not for sale, they are not considered part of the supply. If there is more demand, they can release more from the warehouses to the store shelves, and now they are part of supply. And that is actually incredibly quick to do. It might take only a few hours to drive a truck full of iPhones from the warehouse to multiple stores in town, instead of having to wait to make more. And so they can smooth out supply and demand. If a lot of those warehouses are emptying themselves out to put their items on the store shelves to create more supply, the factories are going to have to build a whole lot more to replenish the warehouses. If not, then you might have a warehouse full of items that is not getting sold just yet. So equilibrium, even though it's constantly shifting left and right, warehouses help keep the supply exactly where the equilibrium is. Consider something that's even harder and longer to make. Maybe a car or a truck takes a lot of time to produce. So we don't want to be lagging behind the equilibrium, trying to catch up with the equilibrium and actually make more cars to meet supply. Instead, they're all in some parking lot somewhere, waiting to be released to the car dealerships to actually be part of supply. If demand goes up, there will be lots of extras in the warehouse that will hold off the consumers and meet consumer demands until the warehouse has time to meet more. If demand goes down, you can just keep stuff in storage for a while. You actually see this a lot in farming as well. Many farm goods can be kept in storage for years just fine. I think of any kind of grain or soybeans or corn, anything like that can be kept in silos, and you don't want to sell right at harvest time. That's when prices are low. So you might wait several months and sell, I don't know, middle of winter or spring next year. I've actually heard a lot of produce can be kept for years as well if you keep the temperature really low, not freezing, but really low, and pump out all the oxygen in the room and just fill it up with carbon dioxide. That dramatically slows down the aging of produce. And they say the average age of apples in your grocery store is probably 2 or 3 years old. Probably not here in Maine, though. We get plenty of farm fresh apples, but that's kind of weird. But there you go. They keep those things in market, not part of supply. And I guess if demand goes really, really low, you could take things off store shelves and put them back into storage, depending on what the item is, and therefore reduce supply that way. Interesting. So as demand goes up and down, producers have to make the supply go up and down to meet that equilibrium point. There is, of course, a moral dimension in everything we do. And when we study economics, capitalism just teaches you how to make the most money. And that is very useful. I don't want to be taught how to make the least amount of money possible. But of course, capitalism cannot replace morality. It cannot tell you what's the best way to use your money. It can only tell you what's the cheapest way to use your money. What's the most profitable way to make your money, not necessarily the right way to use your money. So we do need to be careful that we are being moral and not just clever with our money. Christian consumers need to recognize that producers are entitled to a fair price. Producers take a risk. They have bills to meet. If they are working for you, they deserve to be paid. Never try to cheat the businesses that you're buying from. I know I've heard of stories about people getting really excited about getting free or really cheap things. Maybe they're using expired coupons or something, or maybe they're just being real Karens to the bosses, and so they're getting things for free. And that is not something that we should be proud of. We should not be trying to cheat big businesses. And maybe you say, well, it's a $1 billion company. They won't mind if I steal this or that, or if I mistreat them. It doesn't really matter who you're stealing from. Theft is theft. And even trying to pay an unfair price is not okay. Jesus told several parables about workers and bosses. Old Testament does as well. And Paul uses this to explain that you ought to pay your preachers. He says the laborer is worthy of his hire. That's a proverb all the way back to King Solomon. If the guy works for you, you pay him. No questions asked. Just pay a fair price. We might argue about what price is fair, and that's okay, but you need to pay a fair price. They're human beings too. Stealing from anyone is not okay, even if it's something like piracy, where you're stealing songs or movies or things. Don't steal, even from rich people. And number two, if you're the producer, you need to recognize that consumers are also entitled to a fair price. You should not be trying to rip off your customers either through shady market practices, maybe deceptive advertising. You ever been part of a free trial where you have to give them your credit card and you get a month's free, but then it automatically, deducts for the next month or so? I really don't like that. And if someone offers me something for free and then asks for a credit card, I say, no, thank you. If it's free, you don't need my credit card. If you want my credit card, it's not free. If you are the producer, if you're the boss, you have the moral responsibility to do a good job, to do a fair job at a fair price. An honest day's work for an honest day's pay. It goes both ways. Neither side should be trying to cheat each other. And yes, you got to consider yourself and say, well, I want to make the most money possible. But you also have to consider your neighbors. Treat your neighbors as you want to be treated. That's the golden rule. If you are the consumer, say, if I owned this business, how would I want to be treated? And treat that business that way. And if you are the business, say, if I was the consumer, how would I want to be treated? And treat people right, not just seeing them as money bags that you can exploit. If the producer sets a price above the equilibrium point, here's the equilibrium point. Any price higher than this line right here is going to see the producer wanting to make a lot of that and sell it at that high price, but the consumer doesn't want to buy it at that price. So now there's more items on the store shelves than are being sold. Anything above this line is called a surplus. There's more items than are being sold. We're not going to get into the difference between consumer and producer surplus just yet. Maybe we'll do that tomorrow when we're in person. It's getting a little complicated. Even though the producer sets a high price and gets a really high profit per item sold, they're not selling nearly as many items as they would at the equilibrium point. So the company is making less of a profit, even though they're making more of a profit per item. So for instance, at this price, 0.1, I guess this is price 1, quantity sold is this. If you raise the prices, so let's say here, well, quantity sold will be way over here. So you are losing this much customers, even though you have that price here. You will be selling right around here, this many. So you have this many. That's an awful lot of items that are not being sold. You will make a lot less profit simply because you're not making as much money, but also because you are spending money on making items and not making anything back from it. Every iPhone that you made at the factory that you paid for, you are not getting a cent back in return. It's just sitting on the store shelf. You made the item, not getting anything back. In fact, if you have a surplus, that surplus is costing you money, because you have to rent a warehouse for it to sit in. You have to hire salespeople who aren't selling anything. which is why sometimes we have people selling items at ridiculously low prices because everything must go, because it's actually costing them money. And then just shelf space is money. If I have all these items on a shelf that aren't being sold, they're not just not making me money, they're preventing me from having a better item on the shelf that is making me money. So shelf space is at a premium, and we need to make sure that everything on the shelf is being sold. Every day that the producer has items that are not being sold is costing them more and more and more money. You never want a surplus as a producer. There's an old story that people thought was a rumor for a long time until they found it. Way back in the day, when E.T., the extraterrestrial, came out, they made a video game. And I think they made this video game in just like a week or two. They had way overworked game developers slap together a terrible game, had no time to work on it. It was so awful, so difficult, so buggy that it just did not sell. And so they took these big bulldozers and things, and they dug a big ditch in the desert, and they filled it up with hundreds of thousands of copies of ET. Excuse me, I think they were like Nintendo cartridges back in the day. There's actually a picture of the ET game. You are this guy, ET, and you have to walk around and try not to fall in these holes. And it was just so buggy. They actually found that landfill. And they found hundreds and hundreds of thousands of copies of this game. It was not just not making money, just sitting on the store shelves was costing them money. Next time, we will see what producer can do about a surplus. Because surpluses are so damaging, cost so much money. If you find yourself in a surplus, you have to sell that stuff. And there's really only three ways to do that. Number one, you can make people want it more, try to increase the demand. Number two, you can try to decrease the supply in some way. Usually that means just making less of it for the future. Although in the Great Depression, one way to lower food prices was the government paid farmers to just slaughter their hogs and let them rot in the fields and burn their warehouses full of crops. And that's not a great way to decrease supply, but people have done it. Or number three, lower your prices. If you lower your prices, you will find the equilibrium point, and you will find the point where people buy everything you have and there is no surplus. We will talk about these more tomorrow. Have a great day.